He invited her to humiliate her. She showed up to burn everything down. Roman Moretti built his empire on fear, silence, and the graves of people who knew too much. He thought Naomi Carter was one of them, penniless, broken, erased. Tonight, at the most powerful gathering the city had ever seen, he expected to remind the world who he was. Instead, a black limousine pulled to the entrance. The doors opened, and three children with his eyes stepped into the light. Every camera in the ballroom turned. Every powerful man in the room went very, very still. If you're watching this story from your city, drop a comment below and tell me where you're from. I want to see how far this one travels. Hit that like button if you're staying until the end. You're going to want to see how this falls apart. The night Roman Moretti chose to destroy Naomi Carter was the same night she chose to destroy him back. And neither of them knew it until the limousine door swung open and the city's most powerful people stopped breathing. It started, as most disasters do, with a decision made out of pride. Roman had been planning the Meridian Gala for 4 months. Not because the Moretti Family Foundation needed the optics. It didn't, not anymore. But because Roman had reached the age and the altitude where a man stopped doing things out of necessity and started doing them out of appetite. He was 51 years old. He controlled 3 legitimate holding companies, 2 port authorities through a web of shell contracts, and the silence of enough judges and aldermen to run a small government. He had survived 2 federal investigations, a coup attempt from within his own organization, and a marriage that had, in his version of events, simply failed. The gala was held at the Carrington Hotel, a Beaux-Arts building on the corner of 5th and Meridian that Roman had quietly acquired through a construction trust 18 months prior. The ballroom seated 400 and that night seated 412, which the fire marshal, having received a very generous anonymous donation to his department's equipment fund, chose not to notice. The room was a study in controlled excess. White orchids shipped from Colombia. String quartet positioned at a volume that allowed conversation without requiring it. Servers in black moving between tables like chess pieces someone had already decided the outcome for. Roman stood near the east bar with a glass of scotch. He hadn't yet touched and watched the room fill. He was a large man, not in the soft way money sometimes made men large, but in the way of someone who had been built hard and had only partially softened with age. His hair had gone silver at the temples. His face carried the particular stillness of someone accustomed to reading rooms without appearing to. He wore his tuxedo the way men who had not grown up wearing tuxedos wore them, correctly, precisely, with an invisible seam of discomfort that only people who knew what to look for could see. Beside him, holding a glass of sparkling water and wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's cars, stood Vincent Caruso, his underboss. 15 years at his right hand, 12 of those years, Roman had trusted him completely. "The Hargrove contingent is late," Vincent said. He said it the way he said most things, flat, observational, without inflection that might commit him to an opinion before he knew Roman's. "They'll come," Roman said. "Hargrove doesn't miss a room like this. He can't afford to." Vincent's eyes moved across the crowd in small, practiced increments. "Everything's set, security on all 4 entrances. Pellegrini's people are handling the east corridor since we're light on the south wing." A pause. "The evening should go smoothly." Roman turned to look at him then, just a fraction, enough to catch the flatness behind Vincent's eyes, the slight careful quality of the word smoothly, as if it had been chosen in advance. "Something on your mind?" Roman asked. "Nothing that won't keep." Roman turned back to the room. He lifted the scotch and finally drank. He had added one name to the guest list himself 2 weeks prior, without telling Vincent or anyone else. He had done it through a third-party event coordinator, paid in cash, routed through a shell account that even his own accountants didn't have full visibility on. The name was Naomi Carter, not Naomi Moretti. She had never taken his name, and that had been one of the first fault lines, though he hadn't understood it at the time. Just Naomi Carter. With a +1 invitation, because he didn't know if she had remarried and he had wanted, at the time, to allow for the possibility so he could watch that too. He had found her 6 months ago through a private investigator he used for matters. He didn't want touching the organization, a small, bespectacled man named Galt, who worked out of a second-floor office above a dry cleaner in the financial district and who, in Roman's opinion, was worth 3 times what he was paid. Galt had located Naomi in 11 days. She was in the city. She had been in the city for at least 3 years. She ran something, a consultancy of some kind, Galt had said, though the corporate structure was complicated enough that even Galt had only partial visibility. She was not remarried. She lived in a residence that, by the address, Galt had estimated cost somewhere north of 4 million, which had made Roman pause longer than he expected. He had told himself it didn't matter. Whatever she had done, whoever had helped her, it was irrelevant. What mattered was the image. Naomi Carter, walking into a room full of the most powerful people in this city as Roman Moretti's guest, on Roman Moretti's terms. He had imagined her grateful. He had imagined her slightly desperate. He had imagined the look on her face when she understood that after all this time, he still had the power to summon her with a gilded card. He had not imagined the limousine. He had not imagined 3 children. He was at the far end of the bar when the murmur started near the entrance. It wasn't loud. It was actually the opposite of loud, a sudden collapse of the ambient sound in the room that spread from the doors inward like a wave moving backward, drawing silence behind it instead of noise. Roman noticed it because he noticed everything in rooms, and because the string quartet, without being told to, without any signal he could identify, simply stopped playing. Vincent noticed it too. Roman saw his chin lift a fraction. His eyes tracked toward the entrance with the particular alertness of a man whose nervous system has been trained for threat detection. "What?" Vincent started. Roman was already moving. He was not a man who moved through crowds quickly. He was too large, too recognizable, and moving quickly in public was a form of showing a hand he'd spent decades learning to keep concealed. But something in the quality of that silence, the way it held, the way it continued to deepen even as the initial ripple passed, pulled him forward at a pace just short of urgency. He heard her name before he saw her. Not spoken loudly, just passed between 2 women near the coat check, one leaning toward the other, a stage whisper that carried the particular voltage of genuine shock. "Is that Naomi Carter?" Roman stopped 4 feet from the edge of the crowd that had formed, unconsciously, in a loose crescent around the entrance. He was tall enough to see over most of it. She was standing in the ballroom doorway wearing midnight blue, a dress that did not perform elegance so much as simply possess it, fitted at the shoulders and falling cleanly to the floor, no jewelry except a single narrow bracelet at her right wrist. Her hair was up. Her posture was the posture of someone who had spent years in rooms like this and had long since stopped being impressed by them. She looked exactly like herself and nothing like the woman he had carried in his memory. That was the first thing that hit him, and it hit him somewhere behind the sternum, where a man keeps things he doesn't examine too often. The woman in his memory had been 28 years old, and she had been real and warm and sometimes frightened and sometimes furious, and always, to some degree, uncertain. Uncertain in the way that people are uncertain when they love someone they're not sure loves them back with equal weight. This woman was not uncertain about anything, and beside her, in a careful line, were 3 children. Roman had no frame of reference for what he experienced in the next 4 seconds. He was not a man who reached for words like vertigo or shock. They felt imprecise, theatrical. What it was, in practice, was that the world tilted slightly and failed to tilt back. His peripheral vision narrowed. The noise of the room, which had been resuming in fragments and whispers, receded to something behind glass. The children were identical, not approximately, genuinely, precisely identical, the way triplets sometimes are in early childhood before small environmental differences begin to separate them. 3 boys, he thought at first, and then corrected himself. 2 boys and a girl, the girl's hair slightly longer, held back with a dark ribbon. They were perhaps 8 years old, perhaps 9. They were dressed with the same quiet precision as their mother, dark trousers, white shirts, no excess. They were not holding hands. They were standing with a self-possession that no child develops without years of being taught, calmly and consistently, that they were worth standing straight for. Each of them had his eyes. Not Naomi's, his. The exact gray-green that his own mother, 40 years dead, had called the Moretti curse because you could never lie with those eyes. The same slightly heavy brow, the same slight downward pull at the outer corners that gave all the Moretti men a resting expression of skepticism. They couldn't shake even when they were trying to smile. He knew them in a way that bypassed thought entirely, the way a body recognizes a physical law before the mind has time to name it. He had never seen them before in his life. He had never been told they existed. and he knew them the way he would have known his own hand in the dark. Someone near him said his name. He didn't turn. Naomi's eyes had already found him across the room. They had found him the moment she walked in, he realized. She had been looking directly at him since the door, with the calm, unambiguous directness of someone who had rehearsed nothing because they no longer needed to rehearse. She crossed the room toward him, and the crowd parted the way crowds part for people who don't slow down for them. The three children moved with her in a close formation, not hurried, not nervous. One of the boys glanced up briefly at the chandelier above them with the mild scientific interest of a child cataloging an environment. The other kept his eyes forward. The girl looked at nothing in particular with the expression of someone whose thoughts were elsewhere and had been for some time. The room was very quiet. Roman stood still. She stopped 4 feet from him, the same distance he'd stopped from the crowd at the entrance, which he would not notice until much later. And she looked at him with those dark eyes that had once been the last thing he'd wanted to look away from, and she said, in a voice pitched only for the two of them and the immediate radius of witnesses who could not help but hear, "Roman." That was all. Just his name. Name. The way you say the name of a place you've been to and are not nostalgic for. He said, "Naomi." His voice came out level. He was grateful for that, at least. The silence around them was complete. Somewhere in the back of the room, a fork touched a plate, and the sound of it was audible. "You look well," she said, and the extraordinary thing was that she appeared to mean it, without warmth, without bitterness, the way a navigator reads an instrument. "You—" He stopped. Started again. "I didn't know you were bringing children." "I know you didn't." One of the boys was looking at him now. The direct one. The one with his chin lifted and his eyes narrowed in precisely the way Roman's own corporate photographs showed him narrowing his when he was determining whether something was worth his time. Roman felt the breath go out of him in a slow, controlled exhale that he hoped, at a distance, looked like calm. "Whose children are these?" he said. He said it flatly, not as a question. Naomi tilted her head, one small deliberate degree. "You know whose?" He did. He had known for approximately 90 seconds, and the knowing had not gotten easier in any of those seconds. But he held the line because that was what he did. He held lines under pressure. He had built an entire life on the skill of holding lines under pressure. And he said, "I'd like to hear you say it." "Their names," she said, "are Marcus, Daniel, and Elise. They are 9 years old. They were born on the 14th of March, which you will be able to calculate backward from without any difficulty if you choose to." She paused. One breath. "They have known your name their entire lives. You have not known theirs until this moment. I think that particular imbalance is worth noting." Roman looked at the children. The boy, Marcus or Daniel, he didn't know which, had not looked away from him since the moment Naomi stopped walking. The girl, Elise, had now turned her attention to him with an expression of calm appraisal that looked so much like his own that it made something tighten in his chest with a ferocity he had not expected and was not prepared for. The third child, the other boy, was looking at the floor. His jaw was set. Of all three, he was the one who appeared to be working hardest at something, and Roman had the sudden, unsettling impression that what he was working at was not crying. "This is not the place," Roman said, low, controlled. "You chose the place," Naomi said. "I didn't know." "You didn't want to know. That's a different sentence." She said it without heat. That was the thing that was hardest to brace against. Not the anger he'd expected, not the desperation he'd been told himself he'd see, but this absolute even temperature. This woman standing in his ballroom in front of 400 of his guests, with 3 of his children, and an absence of urgency that made it clear she was not afraid of what happened next. Behind him, Roman heard Vincent's footsteps. Quiet, careful, closer than they should have been for a social moment. "Roman," Vincent's voice just at his shoulder. "Perhaps we should—" "Give us a moment," Roman said without turning. A pause. "Of course." The footsteps retreated, but not far. Around them the room was performing the social function of not watching while watching entirely. Guests angled toward their companions, heads bent in conversation, but eyes tracking, peripheral and sharp, every detail being filed for retelling later. Roman was aware of this the way he was always aware of it in rooms. Tonight it landed differently. He looked at Naomi. He made himself stay in the facts. You're saying they're mine. I'm not saying anything, she said. I stopped saying things to people who don't want to hear them approximately 9 years and 3 months ago. She let that land. Then, a DNA test will confirm what your eyes are already telling you. I assumed you'd want one. I brought documentation of the children's birth records, their medical histories, and a letter from my attorney. You can have all of it verified at whatever pace you choose. She held his gaze. I'm not here to fight with you, Roman. I'm not here to take anything. I'm here because they deserve to walk into a room like this with their heads up, and I promised myself they would. You promised yourself. He heard the edge come into his voice before he could calibrate it. You hid them from me for 9 years, and you're framing it as a promise you made to yourself. For the first time, something moved behind her eyes. Not quite anger, more like the shadow of it, carefully managed. I hid them, she said, because someone tried to kill me for being pregnant with them. The room continued to breathe. The string quartet had not resumed. Somewhere near the east corridor, one of the servers had stopped moving. Roman looked at her for a long moment. Say that again, he said. You heard me. Say it again. She met his eyes. 3 days after I found out I was pregnant, someone ran my car off Route 9. I was 6 weeks along. I was alone. The car went down an embankment, and I walked out of a creek bed in the dark with 2 broken ribs and a dislocated shoulder because there was no other option. She said this the way a surgeon describes a procedure, precise, without drama, each word doing exactly its job. The accident report said it was black ice. There was no black ice. I have photographs of the other vehicle's paint transfer on my driver's side door that were taken before the police arrived, and I have kept them every day since. Roman's voice had gone very quiet. Who? I didn't know then. I had suspicions, and suspicions weren't enough to bring to you, and bringing them to anyone else was a risk I wasn't willing to take with 3 lives I was already responsible for. She paused. I left because it was the only way to keep them alive, and I have spent 9 years being correct about that. You had suspicions, he said. You didn't come to me. Her expression shifted, just slightly, just enough to let something through. Would you have believed me? He held that question like a stone in his hand, feeling the weight of it. The honest answer was no. He knew it before he finished forming the thought. 9 years ago, Roman Moretti had been at the peak of his power and the depth of his certainty, and a young woman coming to him with a story about paint transfer on an embankment and the claim that someone inside his organization had tried to kill her for carrying his child. He would have listened. He would have assigned men to look into it, and the men he would have assigned might have been exactly the wrong men. I'm going to need names, he said. I know. All of it, tonight. I have a file, she said. I've had it for 4 years, waiting for the moment the evidence was complete enough to be irrefutable, rather than merely convincing. Tonight is that moment. She paused, and for the first time since walking into the room, something shifted in her posture. The smallest degree of tension, not fear exactly, but the acknowledgement of stakes. I need you to understand that I didn't come here to destroy you. I came here because my children's father deserves to know they exist, and because the person who tried to ensure he never would is standing approximately 30 feet behind you and has been since I walked in. Roman did not turn. Every instinct he had told him not to turn, because turning would show his hand, and the hand he needed to hold for the next 5 minutes was the hand of a man who was calm and present and not yet moving. But his peripheral vision caught the edge of a charcoal suit. Vincent Caruso, who had stationed himself precisely where Naomi had said. How long, Roman said, have you known who it was? I've suspected for 6 years, Naomi said. I've had documentation for 4. I've been waiting for tonight because tonight is the first time in 9 years that the right people are all in the same room. She looked at him steadily. I didn't choose this venue to be dramatic. You chose it. I just recognized the opportunity. Roman was quiet for a long time. The room around them had reached that particular social pressure point where the pretense of not watching had collapsed entirely, and people had simply stopped pretending. 400 people were looking at him and Naomi and the 3 children who stood between them with his eyes. And he was aware of this with the sharp, cold awareness of a man who has lived his entire adult life inside the understanding that perception is architecture. Whatever he did in the next 60 seconds would become the story. He looked at the children, at Marcus, or Daniel, the one still watching him with that direct, careful gaze, at Elise, who had transferred her attention back to the chandelier with what might have been strategic disinterest, at the third boy, who had stopped looking at the floor and was now looking at Roman with an expression that had resolved from the effort of not crying into something quieter and more difficult to name. Not anger, not hope exactly, but the look of a child who has been told something is possible and is watching to find out whether it is true. Roman Moretti had not been afraid of anything in 15 years. He was afraid of that expression. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed the handkerchief he kept there for purely decorative purposes and never used, and he placed it on the cocktail table beside him because he needed to do something with his hands that was not visible as anything other than ordinary, and then he looked at Naomi and said, "Tell me their names again." Something moved across her face. Not softness. She was a long way past softness with him, and he didn't blame her, but the recognition of a choice being made. "Marcus," she said. "Daniel. Elise." She paused. "Marcus is the one looking at you like he's deciding whether you're worth his time. He gets that from you. Daniel is the one on the left who's been watching the room since we walked in and hasn't missed a single thing." A pause. "He also gets that from you." "And Elise?" "Elise," Naomi said, "currently appears to have decided this chandelier is more interesting than you. She gets that from me." Roman looked at Elise. Elise, apparently sensing she had been mentioned, lowered her gaze from the chandelier and looked at him with an expression of patient, slightly imperious assessment that was so precisely and recognizably her mother that it hit him somewhere below the sternum with the force of a physical impact. He said, before he could stop himself, "She looks like you." "She acts like me," Naomi said. "She looks like both of us, and she knows it, and she is deeply unimpressed by it." It was not a moment for something as fragile as humor, and neither of them laughed, but the air between them shifted, not toward warmth, not yet, not tonight, possibly not for a very long time, but away from the particular frozen quality it had held. Behind him, Vincent took a step closer. "Roman." Quieter this time. More deliberate. "The Hargrove people have arrived. They're asking for you." Roman turned slowly and looked at Vincent Caruso. In 15 years of working beside this man, Roman had learned his face the way a sailor learns a coastline. Every contour, every change in light, the particular quality of stillness that meant something was being calculated beneath the surface. He knew what Vincent's face looked like when he was tired, when he was annoyed, when he was running numbers in his head in a meeting while appearing to listen. He knew what Vincent's face looked like when things were going wrong. He had seen that face before. He had never, until this moment, understood what it meant. The stillness behind Vincent's eyes was not the stillness of a man managing a complicated evening. It was the stillness of a man managing exposure. Roman held his gaze for 3 seconds, long enough for Vincent to understand that something had changed, long enough to see, beneath the surface of that composed face, the first molecular fraction of something that was almost fear. "Tell the Hargroves I'll be with them shortly," Roman said. "Of course." Vincent's voice did not waver, the mark of a man who had been managing exposure his entire adult life. He retreated toward the east corridor. Roman turned back to Naomi. "You said tonight is the night," he said. "You said you've been waiting for all the right people to be in the same room." "Yes." "When does it start?" She looked at him. At the man she had once loved without reservation and had not spoken to in 9 years, and had just handed 3 children and a 9-year conspiracy in the middle of 400 witnesses. "It already has," she said. And across the ballroom, in the east corridor, Roman heard the sound of a door opening that, in his own hotel, in his own event, he had not authorized anyone to open, and felt the evening that he had built to destroy Naomi Carter tilt irrevocably off its axis into something that was going to require everything he had left. Marcus, the boy with the direct gaze, had not looked away from his father's face once in 3 minutes. He stood with his hands at his sides and his chin up, and he watched Roman Moretti with those gray-green eyes that knew everything and said nothing. And when Roman looked at him, at this child who had grown 9 years without him inside a story Roman hadn't known existed, the boy did something that made the entire ballroom, every person in it who was still breathing and watching, go absolutely silent. He nodded, small, once. The nod of a person who has been told something might be true and is still deciding, but is willing to remain in the room while they decide. Roman held that nod in his chest like a coal. burning, structural, something he was not going to be able to put down. From the east corridor beyond the door that should not have opened came the sound of footsteps moving faster than the evening's choreography called for. And Roman Moretti understood, with the particular cold clarity of a man who had survived many things by being the first one to understand what was actually happening, that the most dangerous night of his life had just begun. The door at the east corridor was a service entrance. Roman knew every door in the Carrington because he owned the Carrington, and that particular door was supposed to be locked from the outside with a keypad code that only his head of security, a former state trooper named Briggs, had access to tonight. Briggs was standing 12 feet away at the main entrance checkpoint. Roman knew this because he had positioned Briggs there himself, 3 hours before the gala opened, with specific instructions that the east corridor remain sealed until the catering staff needed exit access at 10:30. It was 9:47. He moved toward the corridor without announcing it, without looking at Naomi again, without giving Vincent, who was still somewhere in that direction, the signal of urgency that would put him on alert. He moved the way he moved through rooms when something was wrong, at the pace of a man going to refill his drink. The corridor was a long, white-walled service passage, lit by fluorescent strips that the design team had covered with temporary sconces for the evening, giving it a warmth it didn't structurally possess. 2 servers passed him going the other direction with empty trays, not looking at his face, the way staff were trained not to. At the far end, the service door stood ajar by 3 inches. Roman pushed it open. The alley behind the Carrington was narrow, serviced by a single overhead light that left most of it in deep shadow. A black SUV with its engine running sat 20 feet from the door, facing out toward the street. The passenger window was down. Behind the wheel, Roman could see the outline of a man he didn't recognize. He stood in the doorway for 4 seconds, not moving, reading the geometry of it. The SUV's plates were obscured, not removed, which would be conspicuous, but angled. One edge dipped below the bumper bracket in a way that read as accidental and wasn't. The engine was at idle, not cold start. The vehicle had been there for a while, waiting, not arriving. The driver's eyes were on the door, had been on the door, were now on Roman, and the quality of that look, not surprise, not adjustment, but the flat-held quality of a man who has been told to wait for a specific person and is now determining whether this is that person, told Roman everything the geometry had already suggested. This wasn't catering overflow. This wasn't a vendor running late. He stepped back inside and let the door close. He stood in the corridor for a moment with his hand flat against the wall, not bracing himself, just maintaining contact with something solid, while his mind ran the implications at the speed it had been trained to run them. Someone had unlocked that door. The code was Briggs's, which meant either Briggs had given it to someone, or someone had gotten it from Briggs by other means, or the code had been obtained through the hotel's own security system, which Roman's team managed but did not exclusively control. He pulled out his phone and called Briggs. 3 rings. 4. Voicemail. Roman dialed again. Same result. He put the phone in his pocket and walked back toward the ballroom at a pace that was still, to any outside observer, entirely ordinary. Naomi was where he'd left her, near the entrance, the 3 children arranged around her with the comfortable quiet of people who had learned to wait without anxiety. She was speaking to a woman Roman didn't immediately recognize, mid-50s, dark suit, the precise posture of someone accustomed to being the most prepared person in any given room. An attorney, Roman's read, from the way she was holding a slim leather portfolio against her forearm, like a professional habit she'd given up trying to break. Vincent was not visible. Roman scanned the room in the trained way, quadrant by quadrant, without appearing to. He found Vincent near the bar on the west side, holding a phone to his ear, his back 3/4 turned to the room. His posture was the posture of a man having a casual conversation, but his left hand was doing the thing it did when he was under pressure, thumb working against the side of his index finger in a small, repetitive motion that Roman had noticed years ago and never mentioned. He was calculating something. Roman crossed to Naomi and the attorney without pausing at the bar. "This is Claire Voss," Naomi said, when he was close enough. "She's been my attorney for 7 years. Voss extended her hand. Roman shook it. Her grip was firm and brief, the grip of someone who understood that handshakes were data. "Mr. Moretti," Voss said. "Ms. Voss." He looked at Naomi. "We need to move the children." Naomi's expression didn't shift, but her eyes sharpened. "Define move," Somewhere inside this building that isn't the main ballroom. Somewhere with one entrance. He kept his voice at a level that wouldn't carry past the three of them. The east corridor door was opened from the outside. My head of security isn't answering his phone. I have a vehicle in the service alley that has no business being there. Naomi was quiet for 1 second. Then she turned to the children and said, in a voice of complete and deliberate calm, "Okay, we're going to go look at the upstairs." She said it the way parents say things that are not what they appear to be, and the children received it the way children receive such things when they have been raised by a parent who has needed to say them before, with the quick, cooperative stillness of people who understand that the performance of normalcy is sometimes the most important thing they can contribute. Marcus looked at Roman once before he turned to follow his mother. That same evaluating look, and beneath it now, reading it more closely, Roman caught something else. Not fear exactly, but the awareness of fear, the particular alertness of a child who has grown up knowing that alertness sometimes matters. It sat in Roman's chest like a coal that hadn't cooled. Voss fell into step beside Naomi. Roman moved ahead of them, because the geometry of protection required someone in front, and he was not capable, at this particular moment, of being anywhere else relative to these four people. They took the main staircase to the mezzanine level, which held two smaller event rooms and a private dining space that Roman's team had booked under a corporate name as a secondary operations center for the evening. One entrance, northeast-facing windows, no service corridor access. He had chosen it months ago as the fallback room for conversations he didn't want overhead. He had not anticipated needing it for this. He unlocked it with the keycard from his jacket pocket and held the door. Inside, a round table, 8 chairs, a sideboard with water and glasses, a wall-mounted screen that was currently dark. Naomi shepherded the children in, and the boy, Daniel, Roman thought, the one who watched rooms, immediately went to the window and looked down at the street with the focused attention of someone taking inventory. "Daniel," Naomi said, without heat. "There's another black car on the north side," Daniel said, to the window, not to the room. "It's been there since we arrived. Same plates down thing as the one in back." Roman looked at the boy for a moment. 9 years old, and he was reading vehicle positioning on a street 2 stories below with the systematic calm of a surveillance professional. "How long have you been tracking it?" Roman said. Daniel turned from the window and looked at him with an expression of measured patience. "Since we got out of the limo." A pause. "There's a third one on the south end. Different model, but same window tint." Roman pulled out his phone again and this time called a different number. Not Briggs, but a man named Reyes, who ran external security for his holding company and who had not been part of tonight's official guest security detail because Roman had kept those operations separate, by design, as he always did. Reyes picked up on the first ring. "I need eyes on 3 vehicles," Roman said. "Black SUVs, 2 confirmed on north and south approaches, 1 in the service alley east side. I need plate confirmation, and I need to know if there are more." He paused. "And I need you to find Briggs. On it. No questions." Reyes ended the call. Roman turned back to the room. Naomi was watching him from across the table with an expression he couldn't read cleanly. Not quite vindication, not quite fear, something in the territory between them that had no simple name. The attorney had opened her portfolio and was laying documents on the table in a sequence that suggested prior organization for exactly this moment. The children were in 3 of the chairs. Elise had pulled hers slightly away from the table and was sitting sideways in it with her legs over the armrest, which struck Roman as the most comfortable he'd seen any of them since they walked in, like the room's smaller scale had reduced the performance requirement. "Tell me about the file," Roman said, sitting down across from Naomi. "The financial records go back 11 years, Naomi said. She nodded to Voss, who slid a document folder toward him without comment. "The embezzlement started before we were married. Small amounts initially, routing errors that weren't errors, vendor payments to companies that didn't perform the services billed. By the time we were together, it had scaled to the point where it required cooperation across 3 departments to keep it buried." Roman opened the folder. The first page was a transaction summary, numbers and account identifiers, cross-referenced against dates. His eyes moved down the columns. "This is inside the foundation," he said. "The foundation was the cleanest vehicle," Naomi said. "Charitable disbursements are difficult to audit without access to the recipient organization's records. And the recipient organizations were controlled by the same people running the disbursements. She paused. The operational network is separate. That's in the second folder. The foundation routing was how the money moved. What it bought is documented in what Voss has. Voss placed the second folder in front of him without being asked. Roman didn't open it yet. He looked at Naomi. You said you had suspicions before the accident on Route 9. Yes. What kind of suspicions? She was quiet for a moment, and in that moment he could see the calculation. Not whether to tell him, he thought. She had already decided what to tell him, but how to say it without the delivery becoming about the emotion behind it, rather than the information itself. I found a message, she said, not addressed to me, not meant for me to find. I found it because I was in your office getting a document you'd asked me to retrieve, and the message was visible on a secondary phone that had been left on the desk. She held his eyes. It was short. It said, "The pregnancy changes everything. We can't have her talking." It wasn't signed. The room was quiet. I didn't know the number, Naomi said. I memorized it, and I left the office, and I didn't tell you because by the time I was standing in the hallway outside your door, I had already understood that telling you meant trusting your judgment about who could have sent it, and your judgment at that time was something I was no longer certain I could afford to trust. Roman felt the pressure of that sentence, the way you feel a bruise when something presses against it. Not surprising, not new information exactly, but arriving with a force it hadn't carried before. She was not wrong. 9 years ago, in this particular apex of his certainty and power, he would have investigated, and he would have done it through the people he trusted, and the people he trusted included the man currently standing at a bar on the west side of the ballroom, below them, running his thumb against his index finger. The number, Roman said. The one on the message. Naomi nodded to Voss. Voss turned to the third page of the second folder. Roman looked at the number at the top of the page, cross-referenced against a carrier registration and a billing address, and then looked at the billing address for a long moment. The billing address was a property management company in the warehouse district. Roman owned 3 properties through that company. He had not authorized any secondary accounts attached to its billing information, but he knew who managed the administration of that company's accounts. He had known for 15 years. He set the folder down. His hands were steady, and he was grateful for that in a precise, functional way. The gratitude of a man who needs his hands to be steady and is relieved to find they are. Vincent, he said. Not a question. Yes, Naomi said. Marx, who had been sitting silently with his elbows on the table and his chin on his folded hands, the posture of a child who has learned to be present without demanding acknowledgement, said, without looking up, Who's Vincent? Someone who works for me, Roman said. Used to work for you, Naomi said. That hasn't been formalized yet, Roman said. It's going to need to be, Naomi said. Tonight, before he understands that you know. Roman looked at her. What do you think he's planning? She met his eyes steadily. I think he's been planning it for months. I think tonight was supposed to be complicated. My arrival, the children, the public disclosure, and I think he intended to use that complication as cover for something that required the complication to be significantly worse than it is. She paused. I think the vehicles outside are his. Why tonight specifically? Roman said. Because if I died tonight, Naomi said, in the same flat, precise tone she had used to describe walking out of a creek bed with 2 broken ribs, along with the children, in the chaos of an event that was already publicly complicated, the cause could have been attributed to any number of parties with grievances against the Moretti name. And if you were also removed in the same event, the organization would pass to the man designated as your succession contingency. Roman was quiet. Which is Vincent, Daniel said from the window, still looking at the street. He said it the way a child reports an observable fact. Both Roman and Naomi looked at him. Daniel turned from the window. You said someone works for you, and Mom said used to. If the someone is trying to take over, they'd have to be the one who takes over when you're gone. That's usually whoever's next. He looked at Roman with the absolute directness of a child who has not yet learned that adults frequently prefer not to be looked at that directly. I'm 9. I'm not stupid. I know you're not, Roman said. Had something passed across Daniel's face at that, small, quick, almost immediately contained. But Roman caught it because he had been trained his entire life to catch the things people almost immediately contained, And what it had been in the half-second before the boy put it back behind the composed expression, was the face of a child who has just been told something he has wanted to hear for a long time and doesn't yet know what to do with. Roman looked back at Naomi. "How many people know you have this file?" he said. "Voss? One other person." "Who?" "A federal investigator named Castillo, Financial Crimes Division. She has a sealed copy of everything in those folders, time-stamped, deposited 14 months ago. It opens automatically if she doesn't receive a specific contact from me every 48 hours. Roman studied her. "You've been building toward federal involvement." "I've been ensuring that regardless of what happened to me," Naomi said, "the information would survive." She held his gaze. "I didn't do this to destroy your empire, Roman. I did it to make sure the person who tried to destroy my children's lives was not going to be able to finish what he started." From his jacket pocket, his phone buzzed. "Reyes." Roman answered. "3 vehicles confirmed," Reyes said without preamble. "North, south, and alley. Plates come back to a shell registered 18 months ago, incorporated in the same quarter as a property management account. I'm looking at that connects to..." A pause, the sound of keys. "Carrington Holdings subsidiary, which connects back to me," Roman said, "through 3 layers of shell." "Yeah." "Briggs." "Found him," Reyes said. His voice had changed. "He's in the loading bay, sub-level. He's alive. He's not going to be usable for the next several hours." Roman closed his eyes for half a second. Briggs had been with him for 8 years. Briggs had 3 daughters, and a mortgage in the suburbs, and a picture of his dog on his desk that Roman had always found irritating and now felt an unexpected sharp surge of something for. "Get him out." "Already moving him, Roman." Reyes paused. "There are 6 men in those vehicles, 2 per car, armed." "I know. This is not a conversation play. Whatever this is, it's not meant to be talked through." "I know that too." Roman was quiet for a moment. "Get your people inside. Use the West Service entrance. It should still be clean. And Reyes, nobody in that ballroom gets hurt." "Understood." A pause. "What about Vincent?" Roman looked across the table at Naomi, at the 2 boys and the girl who were watching him with 3 pairs of his own eyes, at the attorney with her open portfolio and her steady hands, at the 9 years he had spent not knowing and the 9 years Naomi had spent surviving. "I'll handle Vincent," he said. He ended the call and stood. Naomi stood too, immediately, the way someone stands when they have been waiting for the moment to move and the moment has arrived. "The children stay here," Roman said. "I'm not leaving them," Naomi said. "I'm not asking you to leave them. I'm asking you to stay with them in this room while I..." "Whatever you're about to go do," Naomi said, "you need me with you. Because the evidence in those folders exists because I built it, and I know where every piece connects to every other piece. And if something goes wrong tonight and the connection to Castillo breaks, I am the only person who can reconstruct it." She held his gaze. "You need me in the room." He looked at her for a long moment. The woman he had summoned tonight to prove something to himself, who had arrived with everything he had lost, and everything he hadn't known he'd lost, and 3 children who were already, 9 years in, more real and more fully formed than he deserved credit for, because they were real and formed despite him, not because of him. "Voss," he said. "I'll stay with them," Voss said, before he finished the sentence. Roman looked at Marcus, who had straightened in his chair the moment Roman stood. "You stay with Miss Voss. You keep your brother and sister in this room. You don't open the door for anyone except me or your mother." He paused. "Can you do that?" Marcus looked at him for a beat that was too long and too measured for a 9-year-old and said, "Yes." "If someone you don't recognize tries to come in..." "There's a lock on the inside," Daniel said from the window. "I checked when we came in." Roman looked at him. "Good." He picked up the second folder from the table and folded it into his inside jacket pocket. "Lock it after us." He moved to the door. Naomi was beside him before he reached it, her heels silent on the carpet, her posture carrying the same quality it had in the ballroom. Forward, deliberate, the posture of someone who had been waiting a long time to stop moving backward. Behind them, as the door closed, they heard the quiet, definitive sound of the deadbolt turning. Roman stood in the mezzanine corridor with the woman he had abandoned and the knowledge of who had tried to kill her and the sound of his own heartbeat, which was elevated but controlled, and said, "Low. When we go back into that room, he's going to see my face." "Yes," Naomi said. "He's going to know." "Probably." "When he knows," Roman said, "he's going to move. Whatever signal activates those vehicles, he'll send it." Naomi looked at him in the corridor's dim light. "Then we need to reach him before he has a reason to send it." She paused. "And you need to be someone he doesn't suspect yet." "He already suspects," Roman said. "The moment he saw us talking for that long, he started suspecting." "Then you have less time than you think," Naomi said, and started walking toward the stairs. Roman followed, and the distance between them down that corridor was exactly the distance of 9 years, and neither of them mentioned it, because there were more urgent things, and because some distances require more than a hallway to cross, and because below them in the ballroom, Vincent Caruso was standing at a bar with a phone in his hand and his thumb working against his index finger, and the 6 men in 3 black vehicles were waiting for a signal, and the most dangerous night of Roman Moretti's life had not yet reached its most dangerous hour. They came down the mezzanine stairs at the pace of people returning from a private conversation, which was what they were, and which was the only useful cover available to them. Naomi's hand was not on the railing. She didn't need it. Roman was 1 step behind her and 1 step to the right, the position of a man who is not escorting someone so much as moving parallel to them. And the distinction was visible to anyone who knew how to read it, which in this room meant most people. The ballroom had resumed its social functioning in their absence. The string quartet was playing again. The servers were moving. The particular ambient pressure of 400 people pretending they had not just witnessed something seismic had settled into the room like weather. Everyone slightly louder than necessary, conversations slightly more animated, the performative normalcy of a crowd that has collectively decided to let the principals handle it and will debrief thoroughly in cars on the way home. Roman found Vincent at the bar, not the West Bar, where he'd been during the call. He had moved to the center bar, which gave him a sight line to both the main entrance and the mezzanine staircase, which told Roman that Vincent had been watching for their return and had repositioned to see them coming. The calculation was visible in the positioning, and Roman let it be visible to him without reacting to it, the way you let a card show without letting the player know you've seen it. Vincent saw them. His expression reorganized itself in the quarter second before social expectation required it to, assembling into the look of a man who is relieved that a complicated situation is returning to manageable, and Roman watched the assembly of it with the detached precision of someone watching a mechanism he now understood the interior of. Roman crossed to the bar. Naomi stayed 2 steps behind him and to his left, which was not where she had been standing all evening, and which Vincent clocked immediately. Roman saw his eyes move to her, read her position, and return to Roman's face with a slight recalibration he covered with the motion of setting down his glass. "Hargrove's getting restless," Vincent said. "Let him," Roman said. He signaled the bartender for scotch. He didn't intend to drink, because having something in his hand gave him a reason to stand at the bar, and standing at the bar gave him proximity to Vincent without the geometry of confrontation. "How long has he been here?" 20 minutes. He brought his lawyer, which means he wants to talk about the harbor contract." Vincent's tone was the tone of a man discussing logistics. His left hand was on the bar top. The thumb was still. He had stopped the tell. Roman noticed that. The absence of the tell, once you knew to look for it, was its own tell. The deliberate stillness of a man who has realized he's been read and is now managing his body with the conscious effort that produces a different kind of giveaway. If you know the original pattern, well enough. Roman had known the original pattern for 15 years. "I'll get to Hargrove," Roman said. He picked up the scotch. "Vincent, walk with me." A pause. Brief, almost imperceptible. "Of course." They moved toward the east side of the ballroom, away from the main cluster of guests, toward a section near the draped windows that the event design had left as a quieter corridor of space for exactly the kind of private conversation that powerful men needed to have in public settings. Roman had specified it in the event layout himself. Naomi did not follow. She moved instead toward a cluster of guests near the center of the room, and Roman trusted her to read the geometry of it, because she had read every other geometry of the evening correctly. Roman stopped near the window. The drapes were a deep burgundy, floor to ceiling, and through the gap between 2 panels he could see the edge of the North Street, the distant dark shape of a parked SUV that hadn't been there 3 hours ago. Vincent stopped beside him. East corridor door, Roman said. He kept his voice level, conversational, pitched at the volume of the room. It was open. Vincent turned to look at him with the expression of a man receiving unexpected information. Open? I'll have someone check the... It was open from outside, Roman said. Keypad code. Briggs's code. He turned and looked at Vincent directly. Briggs is in the loading bay. Someone put him there. Vincent's face did the thing faces do when the mechanism behind them shifts gears under pressure. Not a collapse, not even a crack, but a quality change, like light through glass changing when the angle changes. The performance of concern remained, but underneath it something had gone very quiet and very fast. That's... Roman, if someone got to Briggs... Who knew the code? Roman said. Briggs, your security lead. Probably hotel facilities, depending on how the handoff was managed. Who else? A half second. I'd have to check the distribution log. You drafted the distribution log, Roman said. The quiet between them lasted 4 seconds. Around them, the ballroom continued its orchestrated noise, the string quartet pulling through something with a low, sustained note that sat under the ambient sound like a foundation. Vincent looked at him. The performance of concern had finished its run. What replaced it was not what Roman had expected. Not fear, not the collapse of a man caught, but something colder and more structural, the expression of someone who has been running a calculation for a long time and has just reached the point where the calculation ends. You talked to her, Vincent said. Sad, not a question. I did. How much did she give you? Enough, Roman said. Vincent nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man receiving a weather report he had been expecting. He picked up his glass from where he'd carried it and took a drink, unhurried, and set it down on the nearest table with the care of someone who has decided that the next several minutes are going to require his hands to be free. Roman. His voice had changed. The logistics tone was gone, and what was underneath it was something Roman had not heard from Vincent in 15 years, something that sounded almost like the voice of a man who is tired. Whatever she told you, you need to understand that what I did was necessary for the organization, for your protection, for the long-term survival of everything you built. You tried to kill her, Roman said. I tried to protect you from a woman who was going to... She was pregnant, Roman said. She was a liability. The word landed flat and clean. You were at the peak of everything in those years. The expansion was running. The political connections were consolidating. A pregnancy, a wife with access to your schedule and your properties and your financial structure, a woman who was already asking questions she had no business asking. That was a thread that unraveled everything if it was pulled. He looked at Roman steadily. I made a decision that I believed you would have made if you weren't too close to it to make it. Roman looked at him. At this man he had trusted with the architecture of his life for 15 years, who was now standing in a rented ballroom explaining the attempted murder of a pregnant woman as a management decision, and doing it with the flatness of someone who had rehearsed the explanation sufficiently that it no longer felt like what it was. The children, Roman said. I didn't know about... You knew. A pause. Something moved in Vincent's face. I knew she was pregnant. I didn't know the specific... You sent someone to run her car off a highway embankment, Roman said. She was 6 weeks along. You knew. Vincent was quiet. The message on the secondary phone, Roman said. The pregnancy changes everything. We can't have her talking. That was you. That was a precautionary communication. Say it plainly, Roman said, low, quiet, with a force beneath the quietness that Vincent had heard from him before and knew the weight of. For once in 15 years, say the thing you mean in the words it actually is. Vincent looked at him for a long moment. Then he set down the glass completely and straightened and said, Yes. I ordered it. I would order it again. And if you had any sense left that hasn't been compromised by 3 children you met 40 minutes ago, and a woman with a document folder and a federal contact, you would understand that everything I did was in the service of this organization and your survival inside it. The string quartet, somewhere behind them, resolved its low note into something that climbed slightly and then stopped. Roman did not move. He did not raise his voice. He stood with his scotch untouched and looked at the man who had been his right hand for 15 years and said, You had a federal contact. The smallest fracture appeared in Vincent's composure. What? You said she has a federal contact. I didn't tell you that. 4 seconds of absolute stillness. Then Vincent's left hand moved, not toward a weapon, not yet, but toward his jacket pocket and the phone inside it. And Roman understood in the same instant that the movement was not about the phone, but about the signal that the phone could send, and that if that signal was sent, the 6 men in 3 vehicles outside would receive it, and that whatever those men were instructed to do upon receiving it involved this building and the people inside it. Roman caught Vincent's wrist. Not violently, just stopped it. His hand closed around Vincent's wrist with the simple mechanical authority of a larger man arresting a smaller man's motion, and Vincent went still, and for a moment they stood that way, close enough that Roman could see the calculation running behind Vincent's eyes, the inventory of options, the assessment of the room. "Don't," Roman said. Vincent looked at him. Something in his face had cracked open slightly, not with fear but with a kind of exhausted recognition, the look of a man who has been maintaining a very heavy structure for a very long time and has just felt the first support give. "You can't contain this," Vincent said, low, rapid. "Roman, you cannot contain this. Those vehicles are on a timer. If I don't send a stand down in the next 12 minutes, they move regardless. That's not a threat. That's the operational design. Dead man protocol. I built it so it couldn't be stopped by me being compromised." He held Roman's gaze. "You can hold my wrist all night. In 12 minutes, 6 armed men enter this building." Roman released his wrist. Vincent straightened his cuff. His breathing had elevated slightly. Not panic, but the physical reality of adrenaline in a man past 50 who has been under sustained pressure. "The only way those men stand down is if I send the code from my phone, from this number, with a specific sequence that changes every 4 hours. It cannot be replicated. It cannot be forced." He looked at Roman with the particular clarity of a man holding the last card in a hand he has been losing. "So we need to have a different conversation than the one you came over here to have." Roman looked at him. 12 minutes. He believed the 12 minutes because Vincent didn't bluff about operational mechanics. It was the one area where his professionalism had always been absolute. The one thing Roman had always been able to rely on as structurally true, regardless of what else might be managed or maneuvered. He believed the dead man protocol, because it was exactly the kind of thing Vincent would build. Elegant, self-executing, designed to function without requiring Vincent to make a decision under pressure. Exactly the kind of system a man builds when he has spent 15 years managing a principal he respects but no longer trusts to make the hard calls. "What do you want?" Roman said. "Passage," Vincent said. "Safe and clean. Tonight. Whatever the woman has given you, whatever the federal angle is, I walk out of this building and out of this city, and you give me 48 hours before anything moves." He held his gaze. "In exchange, I stand down the vehicles, and I give you the name of every other person in the organization who was involved. Not 2 or 3 names. Everyone. The entire internal network, documented, with enough evidence to put them away without touching you." A pause. "Because there are people in your organization beyond me, Roman. People who knew. People who have been positioned for years. You need those names more than you need to hold my wrist in a ballroom." The room around them moved and breathed, oblivious. 400 guests, servers, security personnel, a string quartet, a charity gala for an organization that had been quietly laundering influence money for 11 years. A normal Thursday evening in the life of the Meridian elite. Roman looked at the man he had trusted and said nothing. 9 minutes, Vincent said, and he was not being theatrical about it. From across the room, Roman felt Naomi's eyes find him, and he did not look back at her because looking back at her would tell Vincent that she was relevant to what he was deciding, which she was, which was the thing he needed most to conceal for the next 30 seconds while he ran the actual calculation. The actual calculation was this. Vincent was telling the truth about the dead man protocol. He was almost certainly lying about the completeness of the names he was offering. The 48 hours he was asking for would put him on a plane, and the names he provided, however many there were, would be carefully selected to eliminate his competitors inside the organization while protecting his most essential allies. Roman knew this the way he knew his own breathing. Not because he'd analyzed it, but because after 15 years he understood how Vincent structured an exit. But the 12 minutes was real, and upstairs in a room with one entrance and a locked deadbolt were 3 children. 7 minutes, Vincent said. From the east corridor, the door Roman had closed and left closed, came a sound that should not have been audible over the noise of 400 people and a string quartet, but that Roman heard with the particular acuity of a man whose nervous system has been tuned for exactly this frequency, the sound of a door opening. He turned. At the east corridor entrance, where there should have been nothing, where the keypad code had been Vincent's and Briggs's and no one else's tonight, two men were moving into the edge of the ballroom with the deliberate, unhurried pace of people who know the layout of where they are walking and have been there before. Dark suits, not tuxedos, close enough at a distance, but wrong, in the way that people trained to notice wrongness notice. The first man's right hand was at his side and slightly forward, the position of someone whose right hand is managing something at the hip. Roman looked at Vincent. Vincent's face had gone completely still, not the calculated stillness of a man managing exposure, the genuine stillness of a man looking at something that was not supposed to be happening yet. "That's not mine," Vincent said. Roman looked at him. Roman. Something had changed in Vincent's voice. The exhausted clarity was gone, and what was under it was something rawer and faster. "Those men are not mine. I have 6 men in vehicles outside. I did not send anyone through that door. I did not. Those are not my people." Roman's eyes were already back on the 2 men, tracking their movement through the room's edge, reading the vector of it, where they were going, what they were angled toward, and the answer landed in his chest like something dropped from a height. They were angled toward the main staircase, toward the mezzanine, toward the room with 1 entrance and a locked deadbolt, and 3 children and 1 attorney who had a document folder but not, as far as Roman knew, anything else. He was moving before the thought completed. He heard Vincent say something behind him, his name, or a word, or maybe the beginning of the stand-down code. And he did not stop. He crossed the ballroom floor at a speed that was no longer anything like a man going to refill his drink. He was moving with the full, open urgency of a man who has calculated that social concealment is no longer the priority and will not be the priority again tonight. And the crowd parted because crowds part for people who move like that. And somewhere behind him he heard the first real sound of the evening breaking. Not the murmur of the entrance, not the quiet of the corridor, but the sound of someone in the ballroom shouting, 1 voice and then 2. And then the particular crash of a table going over that acts as a physical signal to a room that the night has changed categories. Full stride, and took it 3 steps at a time, his hand on the rail, his body carrying a weight of dread that was not abstract and not manageable. The specific dread of a man running toward his children who are behind a locked door he does not have a key to. And he reached the mezzanine landing and turned the corridor and saw the door to the private dining room still closed, deadbolt indicator showing locked. And beside it, kneeling at the keypad with a device Roman recognized as an electronic override unit, a 3rd man he had not seen come up the stairs. The man heard him and turned and stood in one motion, and Roman did not slow down. He hit the man at full weight, and they went into the wall together with a force that drove the breath out of both of them. And Roman had 40 pounds and 15 years of controlled rage on this man, and those 2 things together were sufficient. And when it was over, the man was on the floor and Roman was breathing hard against the wall with blood on his left hand from someone's teeth, or the wall's edge. He wasn't certain, and the door in front of him was still closed and still locked. He knocked. 3 times, deliberate, the way a person knocks who wants to be recognized as a person. Silence. "Marcus," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "It's me. It's Roman." A pause that lasted long enough that the dread came back in a different form, colder, and then from behind the door came the sound of a chair being moved and footsteps, and then Marcus's voice, 9 years old and absolutely steady. "What's the word?" Roman stopped. "What?" "Mom said if someone knocked, we should ask for a word," Marcus said through the door, with the patient precision of a child following instructions he has memorized. "She said you'd know it." Roman stood in the corridor with a man unconscious at his feet and blood on his hand and his heart hammering and no idea what word Naomi had chosen. And then he thought about the way she had looked at him in that corridor when he said she needed to stay with the children, and the things she had said instead, and he said, "Truth," he said. "The word is truth." A beat. Then the deadbolt turned. The door opened and Marcus stood in the frame, chin up, eyes reading Roman's face, and then the floor, and then the man on the floor behind him with the rapid, systematic inventory of a child who has just confirmed that the threat was real, and that the preparation for it was also real, and who is processing both of those facts at the same time. Behind Marcus, Elise was standing on a chair. She had a fire extinguisher in her hands, both hands, braced, aimed at the door, with the expression of a child who had been told to be ready and had taken that instruction with complete literal seriousness. Daniel was at the window with his phone out, screen facing Roman. "I've been filming the vehicles," he said. "Timestamps, positions, the plates from the angle I could get. It's not perfect, but it's good," Roman said, and his voice did the thing it had been not doing all evening. It broke slightly on the second word, and he stopped, and Marcus looked at him with those gray-green eyes and did not look away. From below, through the floor, through the sounds of the building, came the sound of the gala dissolving. Voices rising, movement, the specific acoustic signature of 400 people. Understanding simultaneously that the evening had become something other than what they had come for. And from the corridor behind Roman came footsteps, and he turned with the last of whatever he'd been running on, ready, and found Naomi. She was breathing hard. There was a tear at the shoulder seam of her midnight blue dress that had not been there on the staircase. Her eyes went from Roman to the man on the floor to the children and back to Roman, and she read all of it in 2 seconds flat, and then she looked at Roman's bleeding hand and said, with a directness that cut through everything, "How bad?" "Manageable," he said. "The ballroom?" "Reyes has people inside now. Vincent—" He stopped. "Vincent is still down there." "Is he standing down the vehicles?" Roman didn't answer immediately, and the not answering was itself an answer, and Naomi's eyes went to Daniel at the window. "3 SUVs, Daniel said without being asked. "None of them have moved." Naomi looked at Roman. Roman looked at her, at this woman who had walked into his gala tonight with the full weight of 9 years and had not once, in all of it, asked him to carry any part of it for her, and said, "There's a 4th player, someone whose men came through that door. Vincent didn't send them." Naomi was quiet for 1 second, then, "Pellegrini." The name landed in Roman's chest like a key turning. Pellegrini's people were handling the East Corridor security. Vincent had said it at the bar, early in the evening, in that flat logistics voice, and Roman had filed it and moved past it and had not returned to it until this moment, standing in a mezzanine corridor with his children behind him and blood on his hand. And the thing that turned in his chest with the name was not surprise. It was the specific, sickening clarity of a man who understands that what he thought was one conspiracy was 2, layered, and that the second one had been waiting for the first one to create the conditions it needed. Vincent had planned to use the chaos of Naomi's arrival to move against Roman. Pellegrini had planned to use the chaos of Vincent's move to eliminate both of them. Roman, Vincent, Naomi, the children, and the evidence in the folder that connected the foundation embezzlement to a network that did not stop at Vincent Caruso, but extended to a second family with its own interests and its own reasons to want this particular night to end with no survivors. "How many people," Roman said, "are in this building right now who want us dead?" Naomi looked at him steadily. "Tonight?" At least 2 separate answers to that question. Elise, from the chair, still holding the fire extinguisher with both hands, said in a voice of complete and terrible composure, "Are we leaving now?" Roman looked at his daughter, at the extinguisher in her small, steady hands, at the expression on her face, which was not afraid, which was something far more complicated and far more heartbreaking than afraid, which was the expression of a child who has grown up understanding that safety is something you prepare for rather than something you are given. He looked at all 3 of them, Marcus at the door, Daniel at the window, Elise on the chair, and something in him that had been holding a particular shape for 9 years shifted, not broke, not collapsed, but moved, the way a load-bearing wall moves when you finally take the weight off it, and it has a chance to return to what it was before it was required to hold so much. "We're leaving," he said, "together." And below them the building continued to come apart, and Vincent Caruso was somewhere in it with a phone and a decision he had not yet made, and Pellegrini's men were regrouping after the one on the floor, and Reyes was moving through the crowd with people Roman trusted, and the federal investigator named Castillo was going to receive a very significant call before midnight, and none of that was resolved. None of it was safe. None of it was over. But the door was open, and his children were in front of him, and Naomi was beside him, and Roman Moretti, who had built his entire life on the premise that strength meant never needing anyone, was about to find out whether he could become something different fast enough to deserve the people who were depending on him too. They came down the mezzanine stairs in a tight formation. Roman first, then Naomi with her hand on Marcus's shoulder, Daniel and Elise moving close behind, all of them at the controlled fast walk, that is one gear below running and requires more discipline than running, because every instinct is screaming to go faster, and you have to override it with the knowledge that running in a crowd creates its own kind of danger. The ballroom below had crossed the threshold from disrupted to genuinely broken. Roman could hear it before he reached the landing. The acoustic signature of a large formal gathering that has lost its organizing principle. Individual voices pulling in different directions. The specific pitch of women's heels moving quickly on marble. Something heavy going over somewhere near the east side. The string quartet had stopped a second time and this time would not resume. Reyes met them at the base of the stairs. I was a compact man, 43 years old, with the economy of movement of someone who had spent 20 years making himself hard to notice and had gotten very good at it. He had two of his people flanking him, a woman named Torres and a man Roman knew only as Kessler, both in event attire that was close enough to blend and wrong enough, if you looked, in the same way the men from the East Corridor had been wrong. Situation, Roman said, moving without stopping. Reyes fell into step. Vincent is at the west exit. He hasn't moved toward it. He's positioned near it. He has his phone in his hand and he's been holding it for 4 minutes without sending anything. A beat. Pellegrini's 2 remaining men are in the crowd somewhere. I have eyes on one. The other went to ground when your disturbance on the mezzanine registered downstairs. The vehicle's outside. Still stationary, all 3. Pellegrini himself. Reyes was quiet for 1 second. Not confirmed inside the building, but his car was on the south approach 40 minutes ago. Kessler saw it arrive. Roman processed this as they moved through the thinning edge of the crowd, guests parting around them with the anxious deference of people who can read that something is happening and have decided that proximity to it is not in their interest. A city councilman Roman had known for 12 years caught his eye from 10 feet away, and Roman looked through him, and the councilman, who understood the look, turned back to his wife and said something that was probably about leaving. The children need to be out of this building, Naomi said, from just behind his left shoulder. She wasn't asking. Agreed, Roman said. Reyes, south exit clean? Cleaner than east. Pellegrini's car was on south, but it was moving through, not parked. Take them out south. Torres stays with them. Roman slowed just enough to turn and look at Naomi. The parking structure on Meridian, sub. Second level, northwest corner. There's a vehicle there registered to a name you won't recognize. Keys are above the driver's side visor. He looked at her steadily. Reyes will get you there. Naomi looked at him. Her dress was still torn at the shoulder. Her hair had come partially loose from where it had been pinned, and one dark strand had fallen across her jaw, and she hadn't moved it. She looked at him with the expression of a woman running a fast and accurate assessment of whether the plan was sound. What are you going to do? She said. Finish it, he said. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now. She held his gaze for 2 seconds. Then she said, low enough that only he could hear it, don't make them lose you before they've had you. He didn't answer that because there was no answer for it. That was honest and fast. He looked at Marcus, who was watching him with that direct, patient gaze, and said, go with Reyes. Do exactly what he says. Marcus looked at him. Are you coming? Yes, Roman said. And because it was Marcus who had been looking at him all evening with the eyes of a child deciding whether something was true, he said it again. Yes, I'm coming. Marcus nodded. The same single nod as the ballroom, that small grave acknowledgement of a possibility being held open. Reyes took them toward the south corridor. Torres flanked the children with the professional, unhurried proximity of someone who does this without making it visible that she's doing it. Roman watched them go. Elise glancing back once, not at him, at the room, cataloging it the way she cataloged everything, and then turned back to the ballroom. Kessler was at his shoulder. Vincent first or the crowd? Vincent, Roman said. Where's the second Pellegrini man? Last position was near the coat check, 8 minutes ago. Find him, Roman said. Don't engage, just locate and hold visual. I need to know where he is when things start moving. Kessler peeled off. Roman crossed the ballroom toward the west exit. Vincent was where Reyes had said, positioned near the exit door with the particular stillness of a man who has run out of good options and is holding his position while he determines which of the remaining options is least bad. He was still holding the phone. When he saw Roman coming, he did not move away from the exit, but he did not move through it either, which told Roman that whatever he was calculating still required Roman to be in it. Roman stopped 4 feet from him. The same distance, always the same distance, as if the evening had a geometry it kept returning to. "The dead man clock," Roman said. "3 minutes," Vincent said. "Send the stand down." "In exchange for what?" "In exchange for the next 3 minutes being the last of your problems, instead of the first." Roman held his eyes. "Pellegrini has men in this building. His men came through the east corridor door, not yours. He was using your operation as cover for his own, and when the dust settled, he was going to walk away and let your name be on all of it." He watched Vincent's face. "You've been running a play inside my organization for 11 years. He's been running a play on you." Something moved in Vincent's face. Not surprise exactly. The man was too controlled for surprise to show cleanly, but the specific recalibration of someone who has just received information that recontextualizes a significant portion of their recent history. "You don't know that," Vincent said. "The East Corridor Code," Roman said. "You told me Pellegrini's people were handling East Corridor security tonight. You told me that at the bar when we arrived, which means Pellegrini's people had access to the keypad system during setup, which means the code that put Briggs in the loading bay and opened that door was not sourced from you." He paused. "You didn't know those men were coming. I watched your face when they came through the door. You didn't know." Vincent's jaw was tight. His left hand had closed around the phone in a grip that was no longer about sending anything and was just about holding something. "He's been in your operation," Roman said. "How long, I don't know yet, but he knew enough about tonight's structure to move inside it without you seeing it coming, which means the network you built over 11 years has had a passenger in it that you didn't put there." "You're trying to flip me," Vincent said. "I'm trying to tell you the truth," Roman said, "which is something neither of us has had enough of tonight." He held his gaze. "Send the stand down. Give me the names. All of them, including whatever you know about Pellegrini's involvement, and then we deal with what's in front of us before it gets worse." 2 minutes. Vincent looked at him. The exhausted quality was back. Not weakness, but the specific weight of a man who has been running a very heavy structure for a very long time, and is now being asked to set it down, and is not sure his muscles remember how. "If I send the stand down," Vincent said slowly, "and Pellegrini's people are still inside this building, I become a target." "You're already a target," Roman said. "The only question is whether you're one with backup or without it." A moment. Then Vincent unlocked the phone and typed a sequence and sent it, and said, "Vehicles are standing down." He looked up. "The names are in a file, encrypted. I'll give you the key." A pause, something shifting in his face. "Pellegrini has been embedded since year 4. He has a man inside the Foundation's accounting structure. Someone I trusted." His voice was flat, but there was something underneath the flatness, something that might have been the ghost of humiliation. "His name is Dowd. Marcus Dowd. He's in this room tonight." Roman scanned the room. Marcus Dowd was a Foundation board member, 60 years old, a former investment banker who had been one of the original architects of the charitable structure, and who Roman had always considered an administrative fixture, present, useful in a technical capacity, beneath the level of genuine threat assessment. He found Dowd near the center bar, drink in hand, speaking to a woman in a green dress with the easy, unhurried manner of a man who is entirely comfortable with how his evening is going. A man who had just watched 2 of his principals fail to execute and was waiting to see what came next. Roman was moving again before he'd finished processing the decision to move, and this time he didn't bother with the pace of a man going to refill his drink. He crossed the room at the speed of someone who has stopped caring what it looks like, and the crowd split ahead of him with the instinctive animal response to a large man moving with focused intent. And Dowd saw him coming at 8 feet and did the thing that told Roman everything. He set down his drink. Not the move of a surprised man. The move of a man clearing his hands. Roman reached him and took his arm above the elbow in a grip that was not social and steered him away from the woman in the green dress, who stepped back with the startled grace of someone who has decided very quickly that she is somewhere else. "Mr. Moretti," Dowd began. "Don't," Roman said. He pulled him toward the east corridor. "Empty now. Pellegrini's two men unaccounted for, Kessler somewhere in the crowd running visual, and pushed through into the white-walled service passage and let the door close behind them. The fluorescent light was back to fluorescent without the sconces. The warmth the design team had imposed on it was gone. It was just a service corridor with two men in it. "Pellegrini," Roman said. "Where is he?" Dowd straightened his jacket with the reflexive dignity of a man buying 2 seconds. He was 60 years old, soft in the way of men who have exercised power through paperwork rather than proximity, but his eyes were sharp and currently running the same kind of calculation Roman had been watching people run all evening. "I don't know what you think you—" Roman hit the wall beside Dowd's head with the flat of his palm. The sound of it in the corridor was loud and abrupt, and Dowd flinched with the full-body response of someone whose composure runs less deep than it presents. "I don't have time," Roman said. "I have 2 of his men somewhere in that room, and I have a building full of civilians, and I have a federal investigator who is currently receiving a document package that has your name on every 3rd page. So you can calculate or you can talk. But the calculation is going to come out the same way regardless. So the only variable is how much of tonight you spend on the right side of what happens next." Dowd looked at him. The calculation ran. Roman watched it run and did not fill the silence, because silence in these moments was a tool, and he still had enough of himself left tonight to use it. "He's not inside," Dowd said. His voice had lost its social register. What was underneath was thinner and more precise. "He's been on the south approach. He was waiting for confirmation that the operation had executed before coming in to manage the aftermath." "What operation specifically?" A pause. "The elimination of you, your underboss, and the woman, in that order. The children were—" He stopped. "Say it," Roman said. "Collateral containment," Dowd said, and the flatness of it, the administrative language applied to 3 9-year-olds, went through Roman like something structural failing. He took a breath. "Let it out." "Phone. Now." "I don't have a direct—" "You have something," Roman said. "You've been his inside man for 7 years. You have something." Dowd reached into his jacket slowly, with the careful deliberateness of a man who wants his hands to be visibly doing only one thing, and produced a phone. Not his primary phone, a secondary older model that he held out with the gesture of someone surrendering a weapon. Roman took it and looked at the recent calls. One number, no contact name, called twice in the last 40 minutes. The second call 3 minutes ago, right around the time Roman had been on the mezzanine floor with a man's unconscious weight at his feet. Dowd had called Pellegrini when the mezzanine operation failed. Pellegrini knew the building play was done. He knew the vehicles had been stood down. Dowd must have seen or heard enough of the ballroom breakdown to understand the timeline had collapsed, which meant Pellegrini was not waiting for confirmation anymore. He was deciding whether to cut the night or come in and salvage it himself, and a man like Pellegrini, Roman knew, did not cut nights he had invested this much architecture in. He was coming in. Roman called Kessler. "Second Pellegrini man, where?" "East corridor. I think he went through the—" A burst of static. Then, "He's in the corridor. Roman, he's in the—" The door at the far end of the east corridor opened, not the service door to the alley. The interior door that connected to the hotel's main lobby, which Pellegrini's people would know because they had been inside this building during setup, learning its structure, mapping it with the same professional thoroughness that Roman had used when he acquired it. The man who came through was not one of the 2 from the ballroom. He was older, broader, with the specific physical quality of someone who has spent decades being the last layer of protection between a principal and whatever was coming. A bodyguard's body, built for absorption rather than speed, wearing a dark suit that was better than the others, and carrying himself with the quiet authority of someone who works for a person who requires only the best of everything. Behind him, Marco Pellegrini walked into the east corridor. Roman had met Pellegrini 4 times in 15 years, twice at industry events, once at a funeral, once at a meeting that had been presented as neutral territory and that had been the only one of the 4 occasions where Roman had fully trusted the neutralcy. He was 68 years old, silver-haired, with the lean, contained physicality of a man who had grown up hard and had never entirely left it behind despite 40 years of operating at elevation. He wore his tuxedo the way Roman wore his, correctly, with an invisible seam of something that didn't quite fit the packaging. He looked at Roman in the corridor without surprise. "Roman," he said, his voice was conversational. Marco, Roman said. The bodyguard had stopped 6 feet back, correctly positioned, and was looking at Roman with the focused, blank attention of a man determining threat level. Roman was aware of his own body in the corridor with the specificity the evening had been building toward. The blood dried on his left hand, the elevated heart rate he had been managing for an hour, the particular tiredness in his shoulders that came not from physical exertion, but from the sustained effort of holding a very large number of pieces in precise position simultaneously. He was aware that he was alone in this corridor with Pellegrini and one bodyguard and a man he had just detained, and that Kessler's last known position had been cut off by static, and that Reyes was on the south side with Naomi and the children. He was aware that he had no weapon, and that the bodyguard almost certainly did. "You came in," Roman said. "I wasn't sure you would." "When the alternative is leaving with nothing," Pellegrini said, with a small measured gesture that might have been a shrug. "Coming in is the only interesting option." He looked at Dowd briefly, a look that contained no warmth and considerable assessment. "Marcus, you look like you've had a difficult conversation." Dowd said nothing. "He told me about the inside placement," Roman said. 7 years. That's patient work." "I've always been patient," Pellegrini said. "It's what separates the people who build things that last from the people who build things that require someone else to come in and manage the consequences." He looked at Roman steadily. "You built well, Roman. I want you to know that. What you did with this organization, with the foundation structure, with the port relationships, it was genuinely impressive work. It's why it was worth the investment to understand it from the inside before making any moves." "And tonight was the move," Roman said. "Tonight was supposed to be cleaner," Pellegrini said. "Vincent's operation was supposed to create an event. An event creates investigation. Investigation creates vulnerability. Vulnerability creates opportunity for a transition that benefits everyone who's positioned correctly." He paused. "The woman complicated it. The children complicated it further. And you?" He looked at Roman with something that was almost appreciation. "You moved faster than I expected." "The children," Roman said, and kept his voice level, kept it even and controlled, because the alternative to control right now was something he couldn't afford. "Say plainly what was planned for the children." Pellegrini was quiet for a moment. Then, "They were a variable I inherited from Vincent's original plan, not one I designed." "But one you accepted." A pause. "Events require clarity of purpose." The thing that had been building in Roman's chest since the moment he saw 3 children with his eyes standing in his ballroom found its form in that sentence. In the administrative distance of events require clarity of purpose, applied to Elise with a fire extinguisher, and Daniel counting cars from a window, and Marcus standing in a doorway, asking for a word his mother had given him. And Roman took 1 step toward Pellegrini, and the bodyguard moved, and Roman stopped. The bodyguard had a hand inside his jacket. Roman stopped. He was 2 feet closer to Pellegrini than he'd been, and the bodyguard's hand was inside his jacket, and Pellegrini was watching him with the calm of a man who has been in rooms like this before, and has always had someone else do the physical part. "I want the organization," Pellegrini said simply. "The foundation, the port contracts, the political relationships, structured as a merger. Your name stays on everything. Your people stay in place. You draw a salary that reflects your contribution. You retire upward." He held Roman's gaze. "The alternative is a federal investigation that I'm in a position to either accelerate or redirect, depending on how tonight concludes. Vincent has already given you names. Half of those names will redirect attention very effectively if they surface in the right sequence." He paused. "Your woman's federal contact gets a different package than the one she was expecting, one that makes the cleanup considerably more complicated for you than for me." Roman looked at him. The corridor was quiet. Behind Pellegrini, the lobby door was still ajar, a strip of the hotel's warm light coming through it. Somewhere in the building, in the rooms and passageways, and the broken social machinery of the gala, the evening was continuing to come apart in ways Roman could not see from here and could not manage from here. Reyes was with the children. Kessler was somewhere, static cut, position unknown. Vincent was in the ballroom with a phone and a stand-down code already sent, and a decision he'd made that could still go either direction depending on what happened in the next 5 minutes. And Naomi's file was with a federal investigator named Castillo, who was going to receive a package tonight, regardless of what happened in this corridor. because the 48-hour contact protocol was already running, and the only question was what that package contained when it arrived. Roman looked at Marco Pellegrini and understood that the man in front of him was not bluffing about the redirect capability. He had 7 years of inside access. He had Dowd's cooperation through whatever coercion or incentive had purchased it. He had a parallel documentation structure that Roman had not known existed until 11 minutes ago. He also had one bodyguard, a man he'd had detained, and no idea that Naomi Carter had spent 4 years building something so complete and so carefully structured that its value didn't diminish with redirection. It multiplied, because every attempt to redirect it generated additional evidence of the attempt. Roman's left hand, the one with the dried blood, was at his side. He became aware of it the way you become aware of something you've been ignoring because you needed to, and he flexed it once, feeling the pull of dried skin, and said, "There's a problem with your offer." Pellegrini waited. "The federal package," Roman said, "isn't mine to negotiate. It's not Naomi's either, not anymore. It's been with Castillo's office for 14 months in a sealed format that generates its own authentication trail with every access attempt. You redirect it, the redirection is documented. You add to it, the addition is documented." He held Pellegrini's eyes. "You've been inside my organization for 7 years, but you've been inside the visible structure. The thing Naomi built, she built outside any structure you had visibility on, because she built it specifically to be invisible to anyone connected to this organization. A beat. Including me." Something shifted in Pellegrini's face. The first genuine shift of the evening, not the managed recalibrations Roman had been watching all night, but the real thing, the actual landing of information that changes the geometry. "You're telling me the file is already active," Roman said. "Running. The 48-hour clock started the moment she walked into this building and Castillo's office registered her location confirmation." He paused. "It's done, Marco. It was done before either of us understood it was happening. The only question left is whether you're in the package or whether you're the person who helped close it." Pellegrini looked at him for a long moment. The bodyguard's hand was still inside his jacket, and Roman was still 2 feet from a man with a hand inside his jacket, and the corridor was still quiet, and somewhere outside the building 3 SUVs were standing down, and Naomi was moving through a parking structure with his children, and none of it was over. Then Pellegrini said very quietly, "Show me." And Roman reached into his jacket for the folder he'd taken from the mezzanine table. The second folder, Voss's, the one with the network documentation. And as he brought it out, he saw Pellegrini's eyes track to it, and saw in those eyes the precise moment when a man who has been in control of a situation his entire professional life understands that the situation has been, for some time, controlling him. The bodyguard's hand came out of the jacket. It was not empty. Roman saw it and had time to register what was in the hand and had time to understand that the decision had been made, not by Pellegrini, whose face was showing something that looked, in the fluorescent light of a service corridor, remarkably like the expression of a man who has just watched something get out ahead of him, but by the bodyguard, who had his own instructions and his own read of the room and had decided that the folder coming out was the moment, and Roman was already moving when the sound came, not a shot, but the crack of the door behind him opening hard, and Kessler came through it at a run, and the bodyguard's attention split for the half-second that was the only half-second available. Roman hit the floor behind Dowd as Kessler cleared the threshold, and the corridor exploded into motion, and Pellegrini said something sharp in a language Roman didn't speak, and there was a sound of impact, and then another, and then the particular silence that follows violence when it happens fast in a small space. The silence of a room that has just used up all its kinetic energy and is catching its breath. Roman got up from the floor. Kessler was against the wall with a cut above his eye that was bleeding freely, and the controlled breathing of someone managing pain. The bodyguard was on the floor with his weapon 3 feet from his hand, Kessler having gotten there with the mathematics of someone who has done this before, and knows that the weapon on the floor is the only outcome that matters. Dowd was pressed against the wall with both hands up, not as a surrender gesture exactly, but as the instinctive response of a man who wants to be visibly not participating. Pellegrini was standing in the center of the corridor. He had not moved during the violence. He was looking at Roman with an expression that had completed its journey from managed authority to something that had no management left in it. Not fear, not quite, but the foundational exposure of a man who has just had the floor taken out from under a structure he built over decades. "It's over," Roman said. Pellegrini looked at him for a long moment in the fluorescent light. Then, from the main lobby door that was still ajar, came a voice, female, precise, with the particular tonal quality of someone accustomed to speaking in rooms where their words will be recorded. "Mr. Pellegrini, Mr. Moretti." A pause. "I'm Special Agent Castillo, Financial Crimes. I have colleagues at every exit. I would appreciate it if everyone kept their hands where I can see them, and we resolved the rest of this evening somewhere considerably less dramatic." Roman turned toward the door. A woman in a dark blazer was standing in the gap of the lobby door with the patient, slightly tired expression of someone who has been waiting in a parking structure for 2 hours and is relieved that the waiting is over, holding credentials in one hand and a phone in the other, and behind her Roman could see 2 more figures in the lobby taking positions with the quiet efficiency of people who have already decided how the geometry of this ends. Roman looked back at Pellegrini. Pellegrini looked at Roman. And then Marco Pellegrini, who had built 40 years of empire on the premise that patience and architecture were sufficient to control any outcome, did something Roman had not seen a man of his particular category do in 15 years of knowing men of that category. He sat down on the floor of the service corridor in his tuxedo, with the careful lowering of a man whose knees are older than his ambition, and put his hands flat on his thighs and said nothing, and waited, because there was nothing left to say and nowhere left to wait that was better than here. Kessler was breathing carefully against the wall. The bodyguard was on the floor. Castillo was coming through the door. And Roman Moretti stood in a fluorescent-lit service corridor with dried blood on his left hand and a document folder in his right, and the specific, consuming silence of a man who has just watched the last wall of a burning building come down, and understood, with a clarity that had no precedent in 51 years of understanding things, that everything that came next was going to require him to be someone he had not yet learned to be. The east corridor smelled like concrete and dried sweat, and the faint copper trace of Kessler's blood, and Special Agent Castillo stood in it with the patience of a woman who had learned a long time ago that the most important moments in her profession almost always happened in the ugliest rooms. She had 2 agents with her. They moved Pellegrini's bodyguard first, cuffed, walked out through the lobby door with the professional efficiency of people who had rehearsed this particular choreography. Dowd went next, not cuffed yet, but flanked, his investment banker's posture finally and completely gone, replaced by the slightly collapsed bearing of a man who has just understood that the structure he's been living inside has been load-bearing in ways he didn't account for. Pellegrini went last, and he went quietly, with the dignity of a man who understood that dignity was the only thing left worth preserving. And Roman watched him go and felt none of what he'd expected to feel. No satisfaction, no relief, just the particular empty weight of a resolution that had cost more than any resolution should. Castillo turned to Roman when the corridor was clear. She was 50, or near it, with dark hair cut short, and the kind of face that had probably always looked more like 50 than its actual age because it was the face of someone who dealt in other people's worst decisions for a living. She looked at his hand, the dried blood, the bruised knuckle where the wall had taken skin, and then looked at his face with the professional neutrality of someone filing information. "The documentation we received tonight," she said, "is comprehensive. More comprehensive than anything we've built internally in 4 years of parallel investigation." She paused. "Your wife built something extraordinary." "She's not my wife," Roman said. Castillo held his gaze for a moment. "The documentation covers the foundation embezzlement, the network of shell routing, the political relationships, and the attempted homicide on Route 9 years ago." She let that last one sit. "That last piece is going to require a separate track. It's older, the physical evidence chain has gaps, but the financial records she preserved create a corroborating structure that a prosecutor can work with." She paused. "There will be questions for you, a significant number of questions. Some of what's in her files implicates operations that connect to your organization, even where you personally weren't the actor." "I know," Roman said. "You're going to need counsel." "I know that too." She looked at him for a moment in the fluorescent light, at this man in a tuxedo with blood on his hand in a service corridor, who had just watched his underboss flip, his empire crack, and a 60-year-old family adversary sit down on a floor, and said, "Your children are in the parking structure. Ms. Carter is with them. She's asking about you. Roman said nothing. Then, Kessler needs medical attention. Already called, Castillo said. He moved past her toward the lobby door. The hotel lobby at 11:40 on a Thursday had been converted in the last 40 minutes into the specific organized chaos of a federal response, absorbing a gala's worth of witnesses. Guests in evening wear standing in clusters with the dazed, slightly indignant quality of people who came for a charity dinner and are now being asked for contact information by men with badges. Roman walked through it, and none of them spoke to him, and he spoke to none of them, moving with the automatism of someone whose body knows where it is going before the decision has fully formed. The south exit took him into a side street and then around the corner to the parking structure entrance. And he went up the vehicle ramp to the second level because elevators took longer and he didn't want longer. He wanted the concrete stairs and the effort of them, and the few seconds of just moving through space without anyone requiring anything of him. He found them in the northwest corner. The vehicle, a dark sedan, unremarkable, the kind of car designed specifically to be forgotten, was parked where he'd told Reyes, and they were beside it rather than inside it. Torres was a few feet away, her back partially to them, giving space without actually giving distance. Naomi was leaning against the passenger door with her arms loosely crossed, and the three children were arranged around her in the particular formation of people who have been in one place for a while and have settled into it. Elise had taken off her shoes and was holding them in one hand, standing on the concrete in her socks with the expression of a child who decided some time ago that the shoes were no longer relevant to the situation. Daniel was sitting on the ground with his back against the car's rear tire, phone on his knee, looking at the footage he'd taken from the mezzanine window with the systematic attention of someone reviewing data. Marcus was standing near the front of the car, and when Roman came around the ramp's corner, he was the first one to see him, and he straightened the way he'd been straightening all evening, that reflex of composure that was already so deeply built into him at 9 years old that it looked structural rather than practiced. Roman stopped a few feet away. Naomi looked at him. Her eyes went to his hand, to his face, to the way he was standing, reading him with the speed of someone who knows how to read a person under pressure, because she has been doing it her entire adult life. She did not ask if he was all right, which was correct, because he was not all right, and the question would have been a social convention neither of them had the energy for. Pellegrini, she said. Castillo has him. Vincent. He sent the stand down. He gave me names. Roman paused. He's going to cooperate because it's the best of his remaining options, and he's always been good at identifying the best of remaining options. He held her gaze. It won't be clean. None of this is going to be clean. There are threads that go through the organization that are going to require... He stopped. There's going to be a period of exposure that I can't protect you from entirely. Castillo's investigation is going to be visible. I've been living with exposure for 9 years, Naomi said. I know what it looks like. He nodded. Then he looked at his children. Elise had transferred her attention from her shoes to him with the evaluating quality she'd been deploying all evening, and he had the sense, again, that very little was being missed by that assessment. Daniel had looked up from his phone and was watching Roman with the careful, room-reading attention that had been his consistent mode since the ballroom. Marcus was still standing near the front of the car, and Roman walked toward him because Marcus was the one who had been holding something back all evening, who had been performing composure over something that had not yet found a way out. And Roman didn't know what he was going to say, but he knew that standing in a parking structure at midnight was not the right place for any of this, and was also the only place they had. He stopped in front of Marcus and looked at him. Up close, in the parking structure's low amber light, his son's face was his son. That was the entire sentence. There was no way to build distance from it through language or management or the controlled processing he'd been applying to everything else tonight. This was his son's face, 9 years old, carrying his eyes, and Naomi's mouth, and the particular set of a jaw that Roman recognized from his own mirror, and from photographs of his father he'd looked at twice and put away because they were too specific to be useful. You did what I asked, Roman said. In the room. You kept them in. Marcus looked at him. It wasn't hard, he said. Daniel checked the lock when we came in. Elise had the extinguisher figured out in about 2 minutes. A pause. She was going to use it. I know, Roman said. She would have, Marcus said, with a conviction that was entirely fraternal. I believe you. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, with the directness that had been his signature all evening, "Are you staying?" Roman felt the weight of that word. Not the question of the night. Not whether he was safe. Not whether the federal exposure was manageable. Not whether the organization would survive the coming months. The only question that had been waiting underneath all of it, patient and structural, since the moment three children had walked into a ballroom and changed the shape of everything. "Yes," Roman said. Marcus looked at him for a beat that was too long and too serious for 9 years old, and had probably always been too long and too serious for his age, because he had grown up in a household with a mother who never let the real question go unanswered and never settled for the comfortable version of hard things. "Mom says people mean what they do," Marcus said, "not what they say." "Your mother is right," Roman said. "So?" Marcus looked at him steadily. "We'll see." It was not forgiveness, it was not warmth. It was the offer of a conditional, and he understood it as exactly that, and it was more than he had earned and considerably more than he had expected, and he held it the way he'd been holding things all evening, carefully, with the understanding that the holding was the entirety of what he was currently capable of, and that everything else would have to come later, through time and action, and the accumulation of choices that either meant something or didn't. "Yes," Roman said, "we will." He turned back to Naomi. She had been watching from the passenger door, with the careful, unsentimental attention she'd been applying all evening to every moment that mattered. She looked at him now with an expression he couldn't fully read. Not closed, not open, something in the precise middle of those things that was its own condition. The expression of a woman who has spent 9 years making hard decisions alone, and is now in the presence of someone who was supposed to make them with her and didn't, and is determining, carefully and without sentiment, what that means going forward. "The house," Roman said. "The mansion on Aldrich. There's no one else in it. There hasn't been for 3 years. He stopped. I'm not asking for anything tonight. I'm saying that it's available, that there's space, that if you needed somewhere while things are being sorted, that's—" "Roman," Naomi said. He stopped. "Not tonight," she said. "Nothing gets decided tonight. Tonight we get the children somewhere that isn't a parking structure, and I call Voss and you talk to Castillo's people, and we let the evening be what it already is." She held his gaze. "Everything else is a conversation for when people have slept." He nodded. She looked at him for a moment longer, and in that look he saw, very briefly, beneath the composure and the precision and the 9 years of hard-built self-sufficiency, something that might have been the ghost of the woman he'd known before all of this. Not a softness exactly, not a return to anything, but the acknowledgement that the person in front of her was not only the man who had failed her, but also the man who had come up the stairs toward a locked door without knowing what was behind it, and that these two things existed simultaneously and would require more than one night to hold at the same time. She pushed off the car door and touched Marcus's shoulder briefly and said, in the voice she used for the children that was different from every other voice, lower, warmer, the voice of someone who has been someone's entire world for 9 years. "Let's go." They got in the car. All four of them, in the dark sedan in the northwest corner of a parking structure, and Torres drove, and Roman sat in the front passenger seat and looked at the window at the city moving past and did not speak. And behind him the children were quiet, in the particular way that children are quiet. After a night they won't fully process for years. Not traumatized, or not only that, but the quietness of people whose understanding of the world has just expanded in a direction they weren't expecting, and who need time for the new shape of it to settle. He heard Daniel say, quietly, to no one in particular, "The third car moved," and then nothing else. The weeks that followed were the kind of weeks that don't have clean shapes. They don't begin and end at recognizable points. They accumulate. The federal investigation moved the way federal investigations move, with the grinding, impersonal thoroughness of a machine that doesn't care about the human architecture it's processing. Castillo's team worked through Naomi's documentation layer by layer, cross-referencing against their own 4 years of parallel work, and the picture that emerged was larger than Roman had known and smaller than he'd feared, which was the best possible version of a truth he'd have preferred not to need. Vincent cooperated. He had said he would, and he did, with the professional completeness of a man who understood that half cooperation was worse than none, and that his best remaining asset was the quality of what he could provide. The names he gave reached into 3 separate organizations and 2 government offices, and one very prominent law firm that had been structuring charitable vehicles for a clientele it had never examined too closely. The law firm's partners would spend the following 2 years in court. The government offices would generate a different kind of coverage, quieter, more procedurally managed, the kind that resulted in resignations rather than prosecutions, and that those involved would always maintain was voluntary. Pellegrini took a plea. His attorney negotiated it for 6 weeks with the particular exhausted efficiency of a lawyer who knows the case is strong and is managing the landing rather than contesting the dissent. He was 68 years old, and the plea kept him out of a courtroom, but not out of consequences. And Roman heard about the terms through Castillo in a conference room in the federal building where Roman spent more hours over those weeks than he spent anywhere else except the house on Aldrich. Marcus Dowd did not take a plea. He contested. His attorney argued creative interpretations of his role that the jury, which had Naomi's documentation entered into evidence in the third week of the trial, did not find convincing. The Route 9 incident, the black ice that wasn't black ice, the embankment, the creek bed, the 2 broken ribs, and the dislocated shoulder, was the piece that took longest. The physical evidence chain was 9 years old, and the primary vehicle had been crushed years before anyone had reason to look for it. And the paint transfer photographs Naomi had taken on her phone before the police arrived had been preserved on a cloud server through 4 phone upgrades with the methodical care of someone who had never stopped understanding their value. The case was complex, and it would remain complex for more than a year, but it was open, and it was moving, and the specific person who had been in the car behind hers on Route 9, a man named Garvey, who had worked logistics for the Moretti organization for 6 years before quietly leaving, and who had, in the intervening years, built a small fencing operation in the Port District, was answering questions about it. Roman dismantled the corrupt structure of the organization the way you dismantle something you built yourself, with the knowledge of where the load is, which pieces can be removed without collapse, which connections are structural, and which are merely habitual. It took more than it looked like from the outside. The foundation was restructured under independent oversight with a board he had no control over, which was the right outcome, and was also, on the day it was finalized, something that cost him more than he showed: the house on Aldrich. Naomi moved in 6 weeks after the gala, which was not fast and was not slow. It was the pace of a woman who was not being romantic about anything and was making a decision based on what was practical and what was honest and what, given the specific circumstances of 3 children who had just experienced the most unusual evening of their lives, was the most stable option available. She brought her own furniture for the rooms the children would use. Roman had offered to prepare the rooms, and she had said no, not unkindly, but firmly, with the precision of someone who understands that the details of how a space is made for a child matter to the child even when the child can't articulate why. She and Voss and a woman named Kieran, who turned out to be the children's primary tutor of 4 years, spent a Saturday doing the rooms while Roman stayed in the kitchen with the door open, close enough to be present, and far enough to be not in the way, which was a calculation he was learning to make with increasing frequency. Marcus chose dark blue for his room. Daniel didn't care about the walls and cared enormously about the desk, which had to be near the window, and spent 20 minutes moving it in increments until the angle to the street was correct. Elise wanted a bookshelf that took up an entire wall, and spent the afternoon unpacking books from boxes with the focused, proprietary satisfaction of someone returning objects to their proper location. Roman watched this from the hallway. He did not participate in the furniture moving or the book unpacking because it was not yet his place to participate, and he knew it, and knowing it was an education in a kind of restraint that was nothing like the restraints he had practiced his entire adult life. Not the restraint of power or strategy, but the restraint of simply waiting to be needed, instead of positioning himself to be necessary. Elise at one point looked up from a box and said, without particular prelude, "You have a lot of empty rooms." "I know," Roman said. She considered this. "You should put things in them." "What kind of things?" She looked at him with the patient, slightly exasperated expression of someone explaining something obvious. "Things that aren't empty." She went back to the books. He stood in the hallway for a moment and then went back to the kitchen and stood at the counter and experienced something he did not have an immediate word for, which was the sensation of a space that had been hollow for a long time beginning to have weight in it. Not the weight of furniture or structure, but the weight of people moving through it who intended to stay. The first dinner was difficult. Not explosively, not visibly, but in the quiet, persistent way of four people at a table who have a shared history that none of them have fully processed yet, and are navigating the distance between what they know about each other and what they don't, while also navigating pasta, which Daniel had requested specifically, and which Roman had made from a recipe he hadn't used in 20 years. Daniel ate 2 servings and said it was acceptable. Marcus noted that the garlic could be more. Elise said nothing about the pasta and said, near the end of the meal, looking at the ceiling, "This table is too small." "We can get a bigger one," Roman said. She brought her gaze down to him. "Okay." And then, after a pause that was entirely her mother's pause, the pause of someone who has filed a thing and moved on. The pasta was good. It was the first thing any of the 3 children had offered him, without it being in response to a direct question. It landed in Roman Moretti's chest with a force entirely disproportionate to the sentence, and he looked at his plate for a moment and said, "Thank you," and did not say anything else. After dinner, Naomi and Roman sat on the back terrace of the house on Aldrich while the children were inside. Marcus reading, Daniel at the desk he'd angled to the street, Elise reorganizing the bookshelf in a way that appeared to have been a plan she'd developed during dinner. The city was audible from the terrace in the distant, ambient way of a city that never fully quiets. Not intrusive, just present, the low, continuous sound of somewhere that continues regardless. Naomi had a glass of water. Roman had coffee he'd stopped drinking. They sat with a reasonable distance between them and the silence that had developed between them over the weeks since the gala. Not the frozen silence of the ballroom, not the tactical silence of the corridors, but a different kind. Something that had been worn smooth by a lot of conversations about practical things, about the children's school arrangements, about the legal proceedings, about the structural decisions in the organization, and that had acquired, in the wearing, a quality that was something like ease without being quite that yet. "Voss wants to review the custody arrangement," Naomi said. "Not because anything is contested, she just wants it formal." "Whatever you need," Roman said. "It's not what I need, it's what makes sense structurally." She looked at him. "There will be periods over the next 2 years where the investigation creates visibility that affects them. School, activities. People will know who their father is in a different way than they did before." "I know. It's going to require conversations with them that I've been having preliminary versions of since they were old enough to understand that their family structure was different from other people's." She paused. "You're going to need to be part of those conversations now." "I understand." She looked at him for a moment. "Do you?" He held her gaze. "I understand that I'm starting from zero," he said. "Not from where we were, not from where I should have been, from zero, which is where I actually am." He paused. "And I understand that there isn't a pace I can set for any of it, that I'm waiting for things I can't accelerate, and that trying to accelerate them would be the wrong move, and that knowing it's the wrong move and still wanting to accelerate is something I'm going to have to manage quietly and not make anyone else responsible for." Naomi was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's the most self-aware thing you've said to me in, possibly ever." "I've had a month of very significant feedback," he said. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. They were not there yet. Not with each other, not for this. But the acknowledgement of something that had the structural shape of humor without the lightness, which was where they actually were, and which was, he thought, honest. They sat in the quiet of the terrace. The city breathed. Through the glass door behind them, Roman could see the lit rectangle of Daniel's window-facing desk, the boy's silhouette bent over something, the lamp's small circle of light. "She forgave me," Roman said after a while. He wasn't sure why he said it out loud. "Who?" "Elise. The pasta was good, that was—" He stopped. "I know what it was." Naomi looked at the city. "She doesn't forgive easy," she said. "She gets that from me." A pause. "The boys will take longer, in different ways. Marcus forgives in actions. You'll do something, eventually, and he'll treat you differently after it, and he won't explain why or mark the moment. You'll just notice the difference." She paused. "Daniel might never say it explicitly. That's not how he's built. But you'll know." "How?" "He'll show you the window angle," Naomi said. "When he trusts someone, he shows them what he's looking at." Roman thought about that. about a boy at a parking structure window counting black SUVs with his phone, filming timestamps, doing the thing he did with the people he'd been raised around and trusted, doing it instinctively, without thinking about whether Roman was in that category, because the evening had moved too fast for the usual filters. He wondered if Daniel had noticed, if the boy had filed it afterward, that he'd turned to show his father the screen without deciding to. He thought he probably had. Daniel didn't miss things. The months moved. Roman drove the children to school on Tuesdays and Thursdays, which had been established not as a gesture, but as a logistic solution when Naomi's morning schedule conflicted with the school's revised start time, and which had become, over 8 or 9 weeks, one of the fixed coordinates of the week in a way that none of them had planned and all of them had quietly accepted. The drive was 12 minutes. In 12 minutes, very little could be covered, but a great deal could accumulate. The specific shorthand of repeated proximity, the way people begin to assume each other's presence, the way a child stops performing for someone they see regularly and becomes instead just themselves. Elise talked continuously in the car, about the bookshelf organization system she was developing, about a disagreement she'd had with a teacher that was clearly the teacher's fault, about the relative merits of various streets they passed in terms of, Roman wasn't always certain what the metric was, but she had one, and she applied it consistently. He listened. He asked questions when the questions were genuine. He did not perform interest, and she noticed the difference between genuine interest and performed interest with the accuracy of someone who had been trained by 9 years of her mother's example. Daniel sat in the front seat on Tuesdays. They had determined this through a process Roman had not been part of but had been informed of, and looked out the window for most of the drive, occasionally noting something. The light timing on the Meridian intersection had changed. The construction on 4th was further along than last week. There was a new car parked in front of the yellow house on Callaway that had been there every Tuesday for a month and probably belonged to someone visiting a relative. Roman received these observations without comment, which was the correct response because they were not offered for comment. They were offered in the way that Daniel offered things that mattered to him, simply, without requirement. Marcus, on Thursdays, sat in the back and read for the first several weeks, which Roman understood as a boundary and respected, and then one Thursday, he didn't bring a book and sat with his arms crossed and looked at the window, and Roman drove the 12 minutes in silence, and at the school drop-off, when Marcus was getting out, he paused with the door half open and said, without turning fully, "The thing you did, in the corridor upstairs, when you heard us through the door." Roman waited. "You didn't have a key," Marcus said, "and you knocked anyway." "Yes," Roman said. A pause. "That was—" Marcus stopped. Then, "Okay." He got out of the car and closed the door and walked toward the school entrance with his bag on one shoulder and his chin up, and Roman watched him go and sat in the drop-off lane for longer than the drop-off lane permitted, and thought about all the things that knock, anyway, means, and didn't say any of them aloud because there was no one in the car to say them to, and they didn't require saying. The legal proceedings moved toward their various conclusions over the course of 14 months, not cleanly, not without cost, but with the directional certainty of a case built on documentation that had been prepared for exactly this purpose by a woman who had never stopped believing the purpose would eventually arrive. Garvey took a plea on the Route 9 charge. He had, in the end, not much to work with in terms of defense, and the recording of his second conversation with Castillo's investigators, in which he described the original instruction and who had given it with the flat, uninvested accuracy of a man who has decided that loyalty is no longer an asset worth the price, was the kind of evidence that simplified things considerably. Vincent received a sentence that was, in the structure of these things, significant. He heard it in the courtroom with the same quality of composed acceptance that had characterized everything about him once the collapse began. Not defiant, not broken, but carrying itself with the self-possession of a man who has always been primarily interested in his own competence and is maintaining that interest regardless of context. Roman was not in the courtroom. He watched the coverage on a small screen in Castillo's office and said nothing when it was done, and thanked Castillo and left. He drove home. To the house on Aldrich, which had a bigger table by then. Elise had located one in an antique store she passed during a school field trip and had texted him the address with no additional commentary, which he had understood as the instruction it was, and which had, in the rooms and the kitchen and the terrace, where the city breathed at night, the weight of people who intended to stay. Naomi was in the kitchen when he came in, reading something on her laptop at the big table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, the way her tea always went cold because she always forgot about it once she was reading. He sat down across from her. She looked up. "Done," he said. She looked at him for a moment, reading his face the way she'd been reading it since the ballroom, with the practiced accuracy of a woman who has spent 9 years needing to be accurate about the things that mattered. "Are you all right?" she said. He thought about this honestly, which was the only way he'd been able to answer her since the gala, because she heard the difference between honest and managed, and it was no longer worth managing. "Not yet," he said. "Getting there." She looked at him for another moment. Then she closed the laptop and wrapped both hands around the cold tea and said, "There's pasta left. The good kind, not the approximation Daniel accepts." "He accepted it," Roman said. "He accepted it because he was hungry," Naomi said. "There's a difference." He got up and went to the stove, and behind him Naomi opened the laptop again, and from upstairs he could hear the specific sound of Elise reorganizing something. A shelf, a drawer, the bookshelf again, always something. And from the direction of Daniel's room the quiet that wasn't silence, because you could feel the attention in it, a mind working through something at its window-angled desk. And from Marcus's room, nothing, which was either sleep or reading, or the particular interior silence of a boy who processed things by holding them carefully until he knew what they were. Roman stood at the stove and heated the pasta and listened to the house around him, the weight of it, the specific sound of 4 people occupying a space that had been hollow and was not anymore, and felt the particular thing he didn't have a word for. Not happiness exactly, not peace, something more structural than either. The sensation of a foundation being laid in real time, imperfect and load-bearing and true. Months later, closer to a year, they drove the black limousine one more time. Not Roman's car. Naomi's, the same one from the gala night, which had been sitting in a storage facility she rented under a corporate name because she had known, even then, that she might want to close the story the way it opened. She had told him this matter-of-factly one evening on the terrace, and he had looked at her for a long moment and understood that he was in the presence of someone who had been playing a longer game than even he had understood, and felt, not for the first time, the specific and complicated respect of recognizing a mind that had outrun his for years without his knowledge. They drove on a Saturday morning in early fall, when the city was the particular version of itself that early fall produced. Cleaned up by the first cool air, the light coming in at a different angle, everything slightly more itself than it had been in summer's blur. The children were in the back, which was enormous and comfortable, and which Elise had decided required specific seating arrangements that she had communicated by simply sitting in her chosen position and waiting for the others to configure around her, which they had. Marcus was in the middle with a book he wasn't reading. Daniel was at the window. Naomi was beside Roman in the front, which was not the way limousines were arranged, but the partition was open and the driver's name was Torres, who had been with them since the parking structure, and who drove without comment and without anything other than the steady, reliable presence of someone who understood that her job was the car and not the conversation. They drove through the city. No destination had been specified, which was new for all of them. Roman, who had not done anything without a destination in 30 years. Naomi, who had been navigating towards specific points for 9 years, and had recently begun learning, carefully, what it felt like to move without one. The children, who were young enough that a Saturday in a large, comfortable car going somewhere unspecified registered primarily as pleasant. Daniel was quiet at his window for 10 minutes, watching the streets, cataloging. Then he turned inward slightly and said, not to anyone in particular, "The light on Meridian is still wrong." "I know," Roman said. A pause. "You could fix it," said with the simple confidence of someone reporting a fact. "Probably," Roman said. Elise, from her established position. "Is that something you do? Fix traffic lights?" "I own the building on the corner," Roman said. "The city listens when the building owner calls." Elise processed this. "That seems like an unusual amount of power for a traffic light." "Most power is," Naomi said from beside him. Marcus looked up from the book he wasn't reading. He looked at his mother and then at Roman and then went back to the book. And Roman caught, just at the edge of his peripheral vision, the corner of something on the boy's face. Small, brief. the expression of someone who has been watching two people for a year and has just observed something that confirms a thing he had been provisionally holding. Roman looked at the city through the windshield. He thought about the gala, about the way the room had gone silent when the door opened, about three children with his eyes walking into a ballroom that was built to humiliate their mother, and doing it with their chins up, because she had raised them to walk into rooms that way, because she had spent 9 years making sure they understood they were worth walking straight for. He thought about a door in a corridor and a word he'd had to guess, and the sound of a deadbolt turning. He thought about pasta and traffic lights, and a bookshelf that covered an entire wall, and a desk angled to a window, and a boy who hadn't brought a book one Thursday, and had said okay and meant something with it that had taken Roman a month to fully receive. He thought about all the things that could not be returned, and all the things that had been built anyway, in the absence of him, that he was now being allowed, provisionally, conditionally, correctly, to be part of. Torres drove. The city moved past the windows. The light was doing what early fall light does, finding the edges of buildings, making the familiar look briefly like something seen for the first time. Elise said from the back, "Where are we going?" Roman said, "Nowhere specific." A pause. "Oh," she said, and the O had in it the tone of someone discovering that this was acceptable, that moving without a fixed destination was not the same as being lost, that it was in fact its own thing, its own kind of arrival. "Okay," she said, and settled back into her position. And the limousine carried them through the city that was waking up around them, past the light on Meridian that was still wrong and would be fixed on Monday, past the yellow house on Callaway, where Daniel's recurring visitor probably belonged to someone getting better, through the early fall streets of a place that had seen the worst of all of them and had continued regardless, the way cities do, indifferent and permanent, and offering the same thing they always offer to anyone still in motion: the next street, the next block, the next version of whatever this is, waiting just ahead.